thank you so much. It's truly an honor and pleasure to be here. The last time I was in Brisbane, actually, it was at a very interesting kind of corporate show, and it was, I only got to see the outside of my hotel for a few minutes, so it's really nice to be back. I want to thank Tabby Gifford and Andrew Brown for the co-chairs and all those who are also responsible and whose names I don't know, so I want to thank you in advance. Yeah, when I think about, I didn't mean to ever get started on making interfaces as a musician, composer. Somehow it just kind of happened. And it happened sporadically, I think over a period of many years. And so I, just thinking about this, I was thinking about perhaps my trajectory through building these different kinds of hardware and using different kinds of software, and kind of why do it? And more and more, I think that when we create art, that somehow can help facilitate people maybe thinking differently about something, and perhaps opening people's minds to new perspectives, and somehow that something's been successful on some level. I took the quote of the gadgets from Jaron Lanier, who wrote the book You Are Not a Gadget, and he discusses the predicament we were in when we base the choices that programmers based things on long ago. But I guess when I think about gestures, some things that come to mind is this notion of imitation of movement. And perhaps one place to start is the theory of mind. One of our many important abilities as humans is possessing this ability, this theory of mind, or TOM, is the ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, intents, desires, etc., and an awareness that others have intentions and perspectives that are different from our own. That is, the theory of mind depends on the deployment of a theory of the mental realm, analogous to the theories of the physical world. One cognitive development in children is the ability to mirror from an early age, that is, imitate the movements and gestures of another person simultaneously, and along with that, imagine how someone else eventually might feel, or what it might feel like to be them. Flowing from this more abstract notion of mirroring and gestures and gesticulating, a kind of syntactical flow that can, in fact, aid in oral language flow. I came back from teaching at Bard College in upstate New York, working with multidisciplines, and one of them was poetry. And one of the poet students was working on his delivery on his own poetry, and one thing that we worked on was kind of a grid of a small informal lexicon of gestures that he could use that could kind of help facilitate, more flow. And so this was just last week, and the thinking of hand gestures to accompany their own reading. David McNeil's book, Language and Gesture, demonstrate that gestures are not merely an embellishment of speech, but are integral parts of language itself. In fact, these underlying processes are cross-linguistic and cross-cultural with larger implications. And I think I particularly think about certain aspects of cross-culturalism and cross-linguistics to think about gestures as being part of us that make where things are very intuitive. I just had a 3-month Fulbright residency in Japan, and I've been actually studying. I have had a gagaku orchestra for a number of years, many years ago, and this on the screen is part of a gagaku orchestra, and this tradition is, I think, the oldest orchestral music in the world that's read from a score from about 900 AD, and the gestures I had a teacher, his name was Tsuenobu Togi, And he traced his lineage in the hichiriki family, which is this reed instrument, to 1100 AD in the Tang Dynasty, pretty much this unbroken male lineage of this instrument. So originally, this music was played outdoors. And of course, there's no amplification, and there's different people, lots of people outdoors and for different kinds of occasions. But one thing that was still present in this culture of music making that he came and he taught us, he was teaching at UCLA, and then I started this Gagaku Society and flew him up once a month, and we took lessons from him and started to learn this very ancient repertoire. But one thing that really struck me was, well, one thing was how he conducted. He conducted sitting on the floor, and he used one hand to conduct the strings, another one percussion, the left hand, and then he used also his legs, like his feet. His right leg would conduct the winds, and the left leg's another group of instruments. So I was just always used to Western conductors just using the two arms to conduct, and he had a very formal way of conducting using all four limbs. But one thing also that struck me was how we were taught to play the instruments. And playing the koto, for example, we would lift up our arm far higher than was necessary for any sonic reason, other than to create a gesture that would linger and could be read by an audience far away that could have a different hearing experience from seeing this gesture being played. And so this idea of gesture I thought was really quite interesting, and how that could be transferred to more of a virtual realm. There's some other things also from other angles that I came around to thinking about interfaces. And one is that when my father had a heart attack, and he was in the hospital, and he almost died from this heart attack. But one thing, when I went to the hospital, they gave me a ticker tape of his healthy heart, and they said he's going to live, he's okay. And the ticker tape was, a few feet long, and it was something that I treasured for many, many years. This is not the original ticker tape, but it's something I found on the web that looks like it. But in fact, it's just an EKG reading of a healthy and normal heartbeat. And this kind of data taken from bodies I thought was really interesting, that how much it resembled, of course, a sound wave, because in fact it was a sound wave. In fact, both light and sound are waves, etc. But having it on this graph somehow made it more of a certain kind of an object of sound, perhaps maybe in the French idea of what an objet is in terms of different ways of conceiving sound. But this was in the later in the 90s, but did a piece where I used I asked hospitals to donate to me medical equipment. So I got different kinds of fetal heart monitors and also a EKG machine. I had readouts of the brain from EEG sensors, and that was a different kind of interface, but it read out the theta, beta, and all the different waves in a different graphic line. And so this was one of this idea. Let me play a little bit of the sound, of the raw sound of the, oh, sorry, it got a little too loud. So that's just to kind of give an idea of the sound of the brain waves. And of course it's a sonification of the data coming through. Here's an example of some of this, the data output, and it's very crude in the sense that it's not, now they have much more accurate kinds of readings from brain output, and it's I guess it's a genre that in some ways can be thought of as data sonification. And there's different ways of approaching data sonification. Just briefly, I think, you can take the data, for example, of an earthquake or the outline of a map, and it might or might not be interesting depending on how it's manipulated or the kind of mediation that takes place. And there's, I think, a group of artists perhaps who think that the more scientific it is, the better it is. But the difficulty of that perspective is that when it's just in its raw form, it does not necessarily, it's not necessarily so interesting, and that really it requires a fair amount of filtering and mediation and scaling, et cetera, to make it something that sounds like, to represent what the data that's coming through, but also making it listenable. So it's an interesting balance. This one project with brainwaves, I superimposed on the ground staff, actually it's the base staff in this case, and had musicians perform it. I don't think I have the file hooked up for that, but in any case, it's kind of various ways of interpreting data that is taken from brainwave activity. Oh yeah, I wanted to think about for a second and reflect a little bit on David Wessel, and I think, David Wessel started CNMAT at UC Berkeley, and he passed away, and I guess I would just like to dedicate my talk, such as it is, to him. He was an amazing scientist, composer, developer of interfaces, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room probably would, I certainly wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for him, and he was really instrumental on the West Coast, certainly, and certainly internationally all his years at IRCOM for his work, but I, he was a mentor of mine, and really feel very sad of his passing this last year. Speaking of which, STIME was where I was able to develop this idea of expanding the koto. And here there's different pedals and lasers which came later. STIME was founded in 1969 by Misha Mengelberg and Louis Andriessen and others. And what's one of the larger boxes under there is the sensor lab, and that was the interface, what they called, to the quote-unquote real world, as STIME called it. And the software was called Spider and was written by Tom DeMeyer. And I had I've met a lot of different artists there who were also working on gestures and interfaces, among them Letitia Sanami and John Rose and Tao Tanaka. Here I am a long time ago using ultrasonic rings and different kinds of, I guess, rings on the fingers to sense the bouncing off of the pings, and those were built at STIME. This is a photo of me using a lot of that stuff that got this kind of a spread in Wired magazine. I don't know if they're still publishing, but at the time I named my instrument interface Monster Koto, because it just felt something kind of like a Frankenstein, part animal, part not, somewhat of a cyborg, some kind of relationship to robotics, etc. And then also had this very kind of homemade quality in the way that Frankenstein was kind of homemade. Yeah. So here's an early version of it, but I'm going to do some later, so I think I don't need to talk about that one. Another way that I use the interfaces of the lasers in kind of an array was also creating installations. And this one is, instead of like 6 feet or 5 feet across, it was across an alleyway, and people had had broomsticks and were waving them to interrupt and to trigger different kinds of sounds. I did pieces with different insects, social insects, and cockroaches in particular would crawl over me and trigger sounds of their own. They make this amazing white noise. It sounds like it's electronic, but it's actually their natural sound. One thing I think about interfaces is that they kind of can lead us into understanding worlds that we don't normally think about, or that we're not able to with our regular senses. And for about 10 years, I devoted a fair amount of performances and thinking about the plants and what's happening with the response of plants, which is really actually quite amazing. So here I have these electrodes, these EEG sensors on the plants. It was actually the same technology that I had used for the brains, and it's really astonishing what plants can actually. They don't have a brain, but they do have a system, a root system, and there's certain cells that really designate where the water flows. And you have the term a lettuce head, and lettuce, which is someone who's, I guess, not very smart, but lettuce actually just kind of opens and closes like a toggle switch. But different kinds of tropical plants or semi-tropical plants, like the climbing philodendron, they kind of decide, do they make their vines climb up here or go over there, and they move and they grow quickly. Aristotle, I guess, talked about what's the difference between a human being and a plant, and he said that, well, plants can move, human beings can move, but plants cannot. And this was, I guess, but now there's these there are these plants in the rainforest that they shoot their roots down, and if it's a hospitable area, they keep their roots there, and if there's not the nutrients they want or the amount of sunlight they want, they cut the nutrients off to those roots, and then they're able to travel on the treetops to other areas of the rainforest. So they're in fact able to be quite mobile, even though they're moving slowly. And I think recently they also discovered that plants have an ability to have ultraviolet vision, and people don't even have that. So there's a lot of intelligence, I think, that's still really untapped with plants. And working with plants over a period of years, I really got to see that they respond in a certain way, and you can hear it sonically when they're hooked up to different kinds of equipment that sonify their response. So this is a kind of a silly shot of me, but they respond a lot to people, in the sense that it's not a proximity sensor, it's not someone moving close to them. It actually, I guess now is based on this real symbiotic relationship that plants have with bees or insects, that things that they need to procreate, and they think that things that they need for their own evolutionary survival. So I did this piece called Pieces for Plants, and it was in different galleries, and it was just a very humble house plant. But it actually ended up being, I was told, one of the most popular exhibits in the museum, because people in the gallery, people would come and they would have tours come, and people would stay there for quite a while and go up and hear the plant respond. So let me see if actually this. I was in NIME at IRCOM in Paris. I think it was 2007. I'm sorry, I don't remember. Maybe 2006. But here's a version that was at NYU of that. So, yeah, so one of the performances, I think they were like, the whole place was filled with different gardeners, and it was pretty funny, the different kinds of audiences that came to the those performances. Well, I had this, I'd been working with different kinds of responses from plants for, maybe 10 years or so, and there's this, I learned about Pierre Sauvin, who was an kind of a home engineer type who was working in these small labs in the 50s during the Cold War. And I guess during the Cold War, there was a lot of ideas of what the Russians were doing and how the US needed to kind of keep up with possible inventions of the Russians. And some of this revolved around the ideas of ESP, or extrasensory perception, and so he had a lab in New Jersey. And one thing he did was he did this experiment where he blew up model toy trains with plants. And then the more I read about that, I thought, well, that's really odd. And I could actually do that experiment. So I kind of did this somewhat tongue-in-cheek imitation of Pierre Sauvin's ideas of this model train. And this was also before 9/11, so there was not that same kind of connotation in the same way. But I took this model toy train and then stimulated the plant, and the plant put out this data, and the data made the train go in a different direction, and then there was just a very small explosion in the gallery, and I did this as part of a residency at Issue Project Room. So that was another kind of interface. I guess it was a toy train, and I was thinking, I wanted to buy my son kind of this expensive toy train, and I was thinking, well, I can justify it if I use it in an art piece, and then I can give it to him afterwards. So that was part of my idea. He's also, now he wants to, he's really interested in drones and kind of these, flying helicopters, and they've got little remote controls, and so I've been thinking of different pieces that I can use, that maybe use some kind of a camera on a drone, because he's just talks about it incessantly. And but anyways, now I think that some of my pieces they're going towards like empathy, but also towards like satisfying his desires for these different toys. One of the other, I don't want to sound like I'm going through a laundry list of my different pieces, but I made this piece called, what was it called? LED KIMONO, and I had to do lots of soldering, and I soldered like hundreds and hundreds of these little things here. These are handmade components for testing LEDs on silver beads, and you can see that the one in the center is like a short grain rice, and so these are really small, and there are a lot that aren't done properly here. It was just kind of quickly done, and I was testing them and seeing if this is the right kind of part to be using, or should I order a different part. A lot of testing goes on here. But I did get really allergic to the solder, and I guess it just happens, but so I ended up using lead. I ended up getting allergic to the non-leaded solder, and so I had to go back and use this toxic solder. And I didn't have much space to work, so I ended up doing it inadvertently a lot on the kitchen table. And then after a while, after a few months, even though I cleaned it pretty well, I started panicking when I read about lead and children's brains. So I had to take my son in to get tested for lead poisoning, and also myself for lead poisoning, but it turned out we were okay. But so anyways, here's a test run of the LED kimono, and there's basically a kind of a grid, crisscrosses, and one side is positive and the other is negative, and I use this kind of metallic thread that's used for fencing, because I guess when they repair the fencing outfits, they use metal thread. So this is metal thread that I sewed. So that looks cool, I think, because it looks like animation almost. Here's another version of a more finished version. This was at the Contemporary Art Museum in Chicago and Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, 2010. This time I had my daughter wearing the kimono. That's her with the horse head on. And the patterns are based on these traditional Japanese patterns of kimono. And there's a scholar, Arnold Davidson, reading from the Futurist Manifesto in Italian. It's hard to understand, it's kind of muffled. So it was responsive to movement, and at different times it reflected it reflected, was like a monitor of a camera. So I'll tell you when that part comes. This was also performed at SIGGRAPH in Yokohama, Japan in 2011. Okay, you can see me moving those pieces of paper, and then that light and shadow has been reflected on the kimono, so it's real-time mirroring. I don't remember what happens next. One thing I liked about this project, though, was the LEDs were like a low resolution monitor. And the low resolution, like 1 pixel per inch, actually. Abstracted everything, and I think it gave an interesting quality. Of course, the Futurists played such a controversial role in terms of being so ahead of their time artistically, but also aligning themselves with the fascists, Mussolini. But okay, that's enough of that one. Let's see. Well, I want to make sure I have a little bit of time to play something too. So I think with that, I'll move over to do a little demonstration of maybe some excerpts of 2 different things, and so I'll do that. I'll do that now. Thank you very much.